Welcome to Cognisations, a podcast where we interview cognitive scientists about their work and how it applies to our everyday lives. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind, which brings together cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, linguistics, philosophy, modeling, and more. Without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. A defining feature of us humans is that we continuously adapt to our environments in order to thrive. One key component of this process is that of learning the contingencies of our environment. Since the 19th century, this phenomenon has been studied under the moniker of conditioning and is usually associated with Pavlov and his famed dogs. Despite the fact that this seems trivial to many today with regard to dogs and other animals, and that we cannot assume that humans with their complex mental lives merely act with the prospect of a reward, the basic idea behind these principles has enjoyed increasing success when applied to the study of the mind. This prompts the following questions. What influence does reward and punishment have on our behaviour? How do the decisions we make based on these principles tie into collective action and economic activity? How do they influence the ways in which we think? Today's guest, Stefano Palminteri, is the person to answer all of these questions, or at least some of them.
He is research director, equivalent of full professor, and heads the Human Reinforcement Learning team at the Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience Laboratory situated at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Alongside his research, he teaches a course on neuroeconomics. Previously, he studied pharmaceutical biotechnology and cognitive neuroscience before holding various postdoctoral positions in Paris, Trento, and London. He's also a member of the European Laboratory of Learning and Intelligent Systems Society and CERC, FSAR, if I pronounce that correctly. He has recently won grants to work on the dynamics of decision-making, learning, and the effects of memory on these processes. Welcome, Stefano.
Thank you for having me in the podcast.
So we're excited to have our conversation with you. So for listeners, could you describe your academic journey till now and how you got interested in cognitive science?
So I guess I'm one of these person that since I was a kid, I knew I wanted to be a scientist. Which kind of scientist was not clear enough at the beginning. To make it short, at the end of my high school, I started reading some books about biology, and I got interested into evolution and molecular biologies. And this is why I enrolled in a biotechnology, you could say the equivalent of an engineering school in Italy. Since I can remember, having intellectual ideas or curiosity, I was always interested in the mind, initially in the form of philosophy, which is the way, especially in the Italian system, you get introduced to this kind of questioning when you are in the high school. And by the end of my master's in biotechnology, I realized that maybe the way I could merge these two interests into biology one side, or in general, I would say hard sciences and the mind, was neurosciences. And this is why my first research internship was already actually in a neuropharmacology laboratory, where we studied the behavioral and neural actual molecular mechanism of addiction. This was a very rewarding experience. On the other side, I also realized that the realm of the cognitive processes that you can study in animal models, although they are very, very important for fundamental research and therapeutical development, etc. But there are things that, of course, you cannot study with the same proficiency, efficiency, and we are a bit. If you're interested in first place understanding human mind, I soon realized why I don't study directly human subjects or participants, I should say. And this is how I made the first move was like from more biology, neurobiology oriented to cognitive science. And during my PhD, I studied under the supervision of Mathias Pesillon at the Brain Institute in Paris. But in the time, I would have considered myself a cognitive neuroscientist. So pretty much textbook cognitive neuroscientist, right? So on one side, we have a track of studies with the patients with brain lesions or pharmacological treatment. It's really clear neuropsychology. We also were at the Salpêtrière, which is one of the sacred places, historically speaking, for neurological and neuropsychological research. And on the other side, we have functional magnetic resonance imaging studies in humans, which it's a complex way to just say that we were doing basically studies in students in which we were simultaneously recording their neural activity with an MRI scanner, the same scanner that you can use to have a diagnosis for your leg and stuff, but can also be recycled to do fundamental research about the brain. So this was the topic, the research topic, the research field, let's say, of my PhD. And what we were investigating more precisely were the neural basis of reinforcement learning processes. And we ended up making some findings. Some of them seems to be have been replicated by several teams since then, seems to be quite established now. After my PhD, it was not like a completely, a huge turn, a big change in topic. So I was still using a similar kind of experimental designs, etc. But I started being more and more interested about the cognitive mechanisms underlying these processes. And when you are interested about the cognitive mechanism, it means that you want to do something that we call computational modeling, essentially. So basically, you go to the blackboard, and what you try to do is to describe the behavior of the actual behavior or the hypothetical behavior of humans or animal or whatever in terms of set of equations that are very precise, formal, and in theory represent in an abstract way the behavioral process that you want to study. And essentially, I got more and more interested in this computational modeling of the behavior. And this is the essentially, this is the if not the field, this is the approach that shaped the building of my own research team later at the École Normale Supérieure. So since the beginning, you can see that I made a sort of a slow drifting from biology to neurobiology to cognitive science to computational modeling across, I would say, a span of roughly 10 years. Right? This is more or less what we do today, while keeping an eye to continuing diversifying or enriching our approach with things that come from other domains. And the two main domains from which we are taking inspiration right now in the lab is artificial intelligence and behavioral economics on the other side.
So in a way, the uncertainty you had as a child to what kind of scientist you wanted to be influenced your career because you changed a lot. So is there one domain within cognitive science that you consider to be your domain, or is it a multitude of different things?
Yeah, so if we're talking about, maybe people listening to this podcast can see the famous hexagon of the cognitive science, right? There are different parent fields. It's cognitive science, including philosophy, anthropology, artificial intelligence, and psychology, neuroscience. I think I started in between psychology and neuroscience, and I'm now moving in between psychology and artificial intelligence. So, but I don't know if it's something that is more or less general, but I think one of the best things in our line of work, essentially, is that we are learning all the time, essentially, right? So I found it actually quite rewarding that every 2, 3, 4 years at some point I start buying books, reading books that open a completely different, or if not a completely different, actually a different field of research, and then you can, essentially make your way as a function of what is the research question that excites you in a given time point.
So I think let's start breaking your interests apart one by one. So you mentioned behavioral economics, you also mentioned computational modeling. So when I was doing my undergrad, I was training as an economist, and whenever I would tell my friends about my training, they would be either very amazed or very scared, just because, and I presume that's because of the amount of formalism and mathematics involved in economics as a field. Now, when they hear about this field called neuroeconomics, I think they would even be more scared about this whole field, like neuroscience entering the realm of economics. So for our listeners, could you just tell us what is neuroeconomics in the first place?
Yeah, neuroeconomics is a term that is so far mostly used in academia to describe essentially a group of scientists that are interested in understanding what are the neural mechanisms of decision-making, and more particularly value-based decision-making, all right? So to understand already this difference between value-based decision-making and the rest, you can see, for example, in some situation, you are presented with, I don't know, for example, think about the famous, the dress illusion that became viral at some point. So it was this picture which, as a function of your prior or the luminosity, etc., could be perceived, this dress could be perceived as blue and white. So this is a form of very elementary form of decision, and it is called a perceptual decision, right? Neuroeconomics is not much about this kind of decision. It's about a not different kind of decision that is what I'm gonna have today for lunch, right? I'm gonna for the salad, for the salad of the pasta, right? As you can see that the decision is a bit different because it's not neutral in respect of what will be your subsequent experience. So you have to refer to something that is, you think you know, but it is hidden to everybody else. That is your values and your preferences, right? So today, am I feeling more for pasta or for salad? It depends on a lot of things. My taste. This is something presumably stable across time. But then it could also be something like whether I'm hungry, for example, I went to sport or not, or can also be affected by long-term motivation. So whether I want to get leaner or whether I have to gain weight for some health-related reason, right? So you can see how it is immediately very multidimensional, and there is a lot of things to understand. Now, back up the definition of neuroeconomics. Again, the definition is hard because everybody maybe would give you a little bit a different definition of this term. But what is in common among, I can say, we neuroeconomists is that we want to deploy empirical techniques that can be of different source, so scientific approach, to understand this kind of decision, right? And to this aim, especially the novelty of neuroeconomics was to bring to the table the idea that techniques coming from neurosciences could be useful for elucidating the underlying mechanism of value-based decision making.
And do we need neuroscience and economics? Do you think that it's vital that we do study empirically these decisions through neuroscience, or could there be other ways of doing so?
Yeah, so I will answer this, and I will say in that I'm probably not an orthodox neuroeconomist, because my answer to that will be no. It's not necessary to look at neural data or a neuroscience technique to understand decision making. And this is simply because we needed to define what we mean by understand. And understand, there are different levels to this, right? And it is totally acceptable to conceive there is a level of understanding that it is abstract from the material biological implementation of the process, right? For example, if I tell you, if I return the questions and tell you, do we need the neuroscience to understand the political attitudes, so something that is high level, group level, social phenomena, you would think this is quite silly, right? Because we can identify regularities, even laws, in how political attitudes are shaped, And we can have a theory about this, which is completely blind concerning the brain, right? Now, if your question to begin with is to understand things at the material or, as we call it often, implementational level, now, of course, neuroscience become necessary, right? And another point of, actually in which neuroscience can be, if not necessary, is different, useful, is that at some point, decision making, let's say traditionally in behavioral economics or in economics in general, but even in psychology, decision making research relied on very, I would not say scarce, but very minimalist data that is essentially the choice made by participants in given situation, which is fine because the choice is precisely what you want to explain. Nonetheless, if it's a measure that has some limitation, so one can totally conceive that we can get inspiration to refine these decision-making theories by looking at other forms of data. And since we all believe, at least we scientists, we all believe the decisions are ultimately generated by the brain, it actually makes sense to look at the brain to find source of inspiration to refine and possibly amend models of decision making. But you can look at the brain, but you can also look at other form of measures. For example, eye movement, something that we also study a lot, actually also in the neuroeconomics, and we are starting doing this more intensively in my own lab, is called eye tracking. And it consists in monitoring the movement of the eyes of the subjects when they perform different tasks. And, well, as you can say, the eye is the window of the mind. It can give you access to things that are more fine-grained than just the subject choosing A over B, which is somehow poor measure at the end.
So you mentioned a bunch of different data points we can use to understand decisions. In a sense, some of them were involved looking at what the brain is doing, and others involved looking at behaviors related to the behavior we're trying to explain, that is the decision. And it calls back one school of thought that was predominant in psychology over the 1950s, which was behaviorism. And it seems that there could be some influence there of behaviorism on neuroeconomics, and also ways in which neuroeconomics sets itself apart from these old methods. So I guess the question is, what's the exact relation between what influence does behaviorism have on neuroeconomics?
Yeah, I thank you for this question. I will apologize because, again, I will have maybe a not very orthodox position on this, because there are a lot of misconceptions about what is behaviorism, and behaviorism is actually, at least the way I see it from my historical reading and my daily practice, is essentially the moment in which cognitive science started. So that the standard definition is that there was behaviorism, but then there's been a cognitive revolution that displaced behaviorism. But as a matter of fact, this never really happened. And if anything, the only form of behaviorism that has been strongly rejected was the radical one of Watson and then Skinner, which became quite prominent also because Skinner was a quite proficient reader. I don't know how many books has bought, and also very big the presence in the press and in the popular media in general. But at the end, the only true common ground between all the behaviorists was the idea that they were rejecting introspection as a way to make inferences about psychology, etc. And this is something that is totally, completely accepted even now in any, I would say, serious cognitive scientist, right?
Can you try and explain exactly why?
Yeah, so the difference was, for example, what early, would say, father of scientific psychology, such as William James, or huge school of Gestalt psychology in German, which both produced very important and still valid results, in their protocol, the idea is that was subject to reporting their own feelings about, percepts or questions, etc. The twist, at some point, this practice of introspection has been rightfully criticized under the assumption that if psychology has to be a science, it has to be a science of intersubjective things, right? So, for example, physics is a science of light, and light we three can agree on precise measurement in instruments, right? So this is a very important twist and the most fundamental twist of epistemological change prompted by behaviorism. Another thing that also was introduced by behaviorism that is absolutely valid today was that, especially since they started relying on objective measures, so reaction times, choice, etc., it also introduced the possibility of considering other models, such as animals, as the valid models to understand psychology. And the very fact that the 90% of the neurobiology laboratories today are based on animal research testify of the heritage of behaviorism. So the neuroscience laboratory that exists today exists under the assumption that studying neuroscience in animals will be useful to understand the brain in humans, right? And this is something that has been essentially proposed, affirmed, I would say, by the behaviorist movement, right? So one last point, and even if this link is never made explicit, it's important to take into account that the behavioral economics, even before the empirical study of decision-making or the theoretical study of decision-making in economics, was based on a paradigm that is called the revealed preference paradigm. So this very complex term stands by the idea that we can make inferences, so we can make hypotheses or guesses about what are the values of a subject only by analyzing the choice, the actual choice that this subject is making. So you can see this is a perfectly behavioristic definition of how research should be made. And again, even if I think this link has been between behaviorism and behavioral economics that was somehow present at some point, it is somehow forgotten. So now, with this in mind, in the study of decision-making, either coming from a cognitive neuroscience perspective or coming from a behavioral economics perspective, it's perfectly coherent with the epistemological and empirical approach that, for example, was proposed by Clark Hull, was one of the more prominent behaviorists that investigated the notion of drive. Drive is motivation, and motivation is very important part of value-based decision-making. But also by Tolman, who was also a very prominent behaviorist that essentially invented the notion of cognitive map, which actually called the field, but this idea that you have a network in your mind that relate things and you make decision acting upon this virtual simulation. So you can see how eminently cognitive is this view, and it predated most of Skinner works, in some cases by 20 or 30 years, right?
So in our ongoing discussion, behavioral economics has come up a lot. So maybe for the listeners, you could just distinguish between behavioral economics and neuroeconomics?
Yes, so the distinction is essentially more in the methods rather than in the research questions that are addressed, right? So first of all, let me explain a little bit what is behavioral economics compared to, let's say, standard or how it's called the neoclassical economics. Is the idea that behavioral economics raised essentially, but not only, but essentially thanks to Kahneman and Tversky, for example, publication of a prospect theory in the 70s, with the aim of improving decision theories coming from economics with insight from psychology. Because, we arrived after the publication of a very influent book by von Neumann and von Gesten. It's, I think, in 45 or 44. In the 50s, more general, the book is The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. They provided the first full axiomatization of utility theory. Utility, I should say, is that the way value is called by economists, right? So we think in general that we make decision based, we say we make decision based on values, and economists will say we make decision based on utilities, right? So the terminological difference, that is not important here. And, they proposed a set of axioms or first principles that a rational agent should follow to behave rationally. It turns out that most of these principles we would actually agree as being the reasonable principle, right? So one famous one is the principle of independence. If I prefer A over B in a set of two options, I will also prefer A over B if a third option C is also presented, right? We would like to make decisions respecting these rules, right? Another important rule is transitivity. If I prefer A over B and B over C, I should prefer A over C. You can agree this is also reasonable. Turns out that by doing the experiment, several scholars discovered many situations in which these axioms, even this very basic one, could be violated. And we end up in a situation in which utility theory was very appealing from the normative point of view. Normative point of view is the way you should behave, so it gives you like a benchmark, but they were quite poor on the descriptive point of view. So if I look at the decision that Stefano made, it will deviate from this. So we needed a better descriptive theory, and the intuition behind behavioral economics is that the hints for this correct descriptive theory should come from observing the behavior, doing the experiment, and therefore from psychology. The increment, you can say, of new economics on the top of behavioral economics is that it's more or less the same, but on the top of that, we also need to look at the brain to make even more informed, plausible theories of decision making.
So your work also highlights the description experience gap as an epistemological problem in neuroeconomics. Could you describe to our listeners what this problem is, given that you just mentioned that it serves as an increment over behavioral economics?
To explain what is the experience description gap, I think we need to make a step back and explain to our listener how we typically actually study decision making in the lab, right? Because here we have two strong traditions. Essentially, the one tradition precisely derives from the behaviorism and the study of essentially animal learning, and we rely on experimental experiments that feature some form of trial and error learning, or as we call it, some form of reinforcement learning. Maybe we can talk a little bit more in detail what is this like. Another set of experimental tradition coming more from economics and later behavioral economics leverage on quite different experimental tools. And these experimental tools are often lotteries. Okay? Lotteries, not like I buy a ticket of a lottery and then I win, and probabilistic lotteries. It's actually funny to remark that at many stage of development of the decision theory, the games and lotteries and things like that played a very important role, at least as metaphor or experimental device. So, but the lotteries that are used in behavioral economics are something like that. So, would you prefer, for example, between one option, so one first lottery, which is a quite boring one that will give you €1 with 100% chance of winning this euro, okay? And we can call it the safe option. Or another lottery that we give you 50% chance of winning €3 and 50% chance of losing €2, right? So which one you're gonna pick between these two? So
The most exciting one, of course.
exactly. So with your response, I would characterize you and the behavior economics as one person that is as a risk seeker. Because as you can see, these two options, there is a safe option, the boring one, and there is the exciting one. The exciting one entails a risk you can lose. But then maybe what about if I take these two options, but I multiply by tens the amount of money, say €100 for sure, and the same 300 or minus 200 with a 50% chance. You can all see, I think you as the listener, that your perception of the gamble will change.
Yeah, as a PhD student, I can't risk.
And then you become risk converse. And exactly what is that? I mean, here in this very microscopic experiment that we did, we rediscovered the fundamental result of behavioral economics, that is risk aversion. So essentially, the more the stake, the less the subjective value of the stake, which make more attractive the safe option, that generally has a lower amount of money at stake. Okay, but you can see that in this kind of experiments, everything is transparent and it explained to the participants. So I told you the probability, the amount of money, how many options there were, etc. On the other thread of research, in the trial and error learning or reinforcement learning, the situation is quite different. It's more like, imagine that you are in a labyrinth and you have to figure out the exit. Okay?
And this is an animal, by the way.
This could be done in animal, but could also be done in principle in humans if a laboratory which we don't have in pets, of course, right? We can come faster.
Are there real life mazes used for this?
I'm pretty sure. But now this is facilitated with virtual reality. When people want to study human maze, and just you buy a VR cask, and that's that. So, and you don't have a plan. How do you do? You try left and right, etc. But then you can also do with the same principle the exact experiment that we've done before, except that instead of telling you what is the value of the two options, we ask you to press a button and see the result, right? So now you have to discover, again, by trial and error, which is the value of the two options. And you have to, once you have made your mind about what is the value, which will not be with absolute certainty, as in the case in which I tell you, you will have to express your preferences, right? So the last modality that we described, we call it experience-based decision making. It starts from sampling options. The first one we talk about, the lotteries, is called described because I give you a full description. Again, from a point of view, and from the mathematician point of view or from the normative point of view, they are the same, except one case will involve more uncertainty, the other a little bit less. But at the end, with an infinite number of trials and infinite number of subjects, there is no reason the preferences should be the same, right? But since, I would say, starting in the 80s and especially in the 90s, a group of researchers centered around actually Gerd Gigeren's in Munich first and then in Berlin, started documenting many instances of what is now referred to the experience description there. So you present the same decision problem, but either in a lottery fashion or in a trial and error manner, and you will not find the same preferences, okay? It's still an active line of research, including in my lab, to try to understand the cognitive mechanisms that explain this gap, and also eventually also try to understand what are the behavioral consequences of it. And we are not the only one. Coming back to your question, the reason why this gap is actually a problem for, at least a challenge for the neuroeconomics research agenda is that arises from considering that to some extent, the novelty, we've said, of neuroeconomics is to leverage on brain data to better understand the decision making. But how do you get brain data, and what kind of brain data? Okay, so in humans, the brain data that you can get generally comes from imaging experiments, as the one that I've done during my PhD thesis. So a subject are in my lab, a structure that is put in a scanner, and I can get some image of the brain while the subject is performing a task. Except that this data will be quite aggregate. So I will never have exactly a measure of one single neuron, but rather, population of neurons across a quite large span of time. So in a sense, I don't have a very big temporal and spatial resolution. Another source of neural data are animal experiments. Animal experiments, even once accounting for the very important ethical problems that can entail, can give access to direct recording of brain activity, because we can implant electrodes in their brain. So we can get, in that case, a very high level of granularity in terms of single neuron recording and very fast milliseconds level, time frame. Now, the fact is that if I want to use this kind of data, which is the richer data to some extent, to refine, to modify decision-making theory, I have to take into account that in animals, I can basically only study experience-based decision, because I cannot explain to a rat that this is a lottery, etc. The only way I can get a rat, or even a monkey, or a pigeon, or any experimental animal to do a task is to, in a trial and error manner, I have to sustain its motivation through rewards and punishments, mainly rewards, and therefore it could be a useful model, but only of description of experience-based decision, and not of description-based decision.
So it's interesting you mentioned that there are different data points that we elicit from experimental animal models and then humans. But I was also thinking that aren't the type of decision-making problems that animals solve very different to the problems that humans solve? Wouldn't that also confound some of the results that we're trying to derive in neuroeconomics?
Yeah, in that respect, there is, I would say, a low level and a high level answer. So, for example, a very immanent, very simple, self-evident difference between the experiments that you can do in humans and animals is that in animals you can only work with what they are called the primary reinforcer. So essentially food, something that is immediately rewarding, right? While in humans, you usually sustain the motivation of your participants with monetary reward. Between food, monetary reward, there is a very important difference, is that food goes to satiation much more compared to money, and you can even argue that money, there is no notion of really satiation. People can still have more money and still be happy, while someone at some point will be actually unhappy to eat more than
It's a good diagnosis of all of our problems, But I guess this is the right time to talk about reinforcement learning in more detail then, and explain, what it is, because we've been talking about it, but...
Yeah, so the reinforcement learning, it's essentially describe. So you can take this definition at different levels, right? So historically speaking, the word has been introduced in the English literature with the translation of Pavlov work, actually. So it became immediately associated to this notion of associative learning or conditioning, right? So as a reminder, the classical Pavlov experiment was to show that through rewards, you could, through trial and error, you could learn an animal to associate a neutral stimulus to a reward. And this process of association was from the process of reinforcement of a link.
And so could you also quickly explain what a stimulus is for listeners?
So in the paradigmatic experiment by Pavlov was a neutral sound. So, for example, a bell that is ringing, and the reward was food. And the measure that was made in that case was not choice, but was rather an innate response, that is salivation, because the dog natural response to food is salivation. At the beginning of the experiment, the animal presented no salivation vis-a-vis of the bell, because it's not food, it's not the reward per se. But after many trials of pairing the sound with the reward, the animal starts salivating for the predictor, that is for the stimulus, that is the bell, essentially. So the term reinforcement learning started to describe essentially all these. It's taken as a synonymous of trial and error learning, essentially. And then it has been used in the psychology literature, and at some point, at the end of the 70s and the 80s, it became integrating quite importantly in artificial intelligence research. And the publication, really the consecration of this is a publication in the 98 of Reinforcement Learning, the book by Sutton and Barton, which is also a very important resource for, uncovering the history of ideas in respect of reinforcement learning, in which reinforcement learning is given is a more formal and general definition. And I always like to take their stance when they say that reinforcement learning is not a particular process, is not a particular solution, but rather it defines a specific class of problems. Now the question becomes, what kind of problems are reinforcement learning problems? Reinforcement learning problems are problems in which an agent can be a human, an animal, an artificial agent, is in an environment and can act upon this environment, and with a goal that is maximizing something that we call the reward. So it sort of defined the reward as the thing that is maximized by the animal by action, right? And then when you accept this definition, I often say this to my students, you realize that essentially life is a reinforcement learning problem, right? Even evolution is a reinforcement learning problem. As a matter of fact, evolutionary algorithms are among the computational solution to reinforcement learning problem, in which the function that is maximized is the fitness of the individual or some other objective function, right? In our case, when we study reinforcement learning in psychology, since we are not studying evolution, but we are studying just adaptation to the stimuli in a given experiment, we try to see how the subject figure out to maximize reward given the option and the environment that is given, and a reward function that we experimented determine and can use to understand how behavior is adapted as a function of this feedback.
So given that that now this definition of learning is so general, so much that we can say that life is a reinforcement learning exercise, does this mean that there's no instance of learning that isn't an instance of reinforcement learning? In other words, are there other kinds of learning that aren't necessarily, driven by reinforcement?
No, not at all. Of course, there are many other forms of learnings, and this is true whether you look at the psychology, neuroscience literature or at the machine learning literature. We are not making an exhaustive list here, but just name a few. For example, especially we mammals, higher species such as humans, we are very much influenced by social learning, which itself can be subdivided in various forms, such as teaching and imitation, right? So these are forms of learnings that are not reinforcement learning. So there is this is a good example. On the other side, for example, in machine learning, you have supervised learning, which is actually the form of learning that is generally used to train, for example, neural network, which again is not is not formalized a reinforcement learning problem, and it is quite different from a reinforcement learning problem indeed. And as you can see in both the social learning part and the supervised learning part, you can see there is this notion of a pupil and a sort of omniscient teacher that can supervise the learning of the other individual, having access to another set of information that's been acquired previously.
So in many cases, reinforcement learning will happen when you don't have something that's analogous to this teacher.
I think, yes. So I think, well, if you don't have any information, what you do is reinforcement learning, right? And then I also think that even when you have other source of information, you will not switch off your reinforcement learning processes, and you can use it as a way of, for example, correcting bad advice, right? Because your teacher may be wrong, and it is good that you keep an eye on what are the actual outcomes that you receive in order to eventually shape at least the advice or the information that you receive, right? Or same thing, for example, this is also something that we studied in the lab. We talked a few minutes before about the distinction between description and experience. What I believe is that these two cases as extreme, only as clearly separated, only exist in the laboratory. But in life, we very rarely do pure description, because when we make a choice, we enjoy the fruit of this choice, except for few ones. So, for example, one-shot decision in life are very few, such as buying a house or marrying. Most of the choices we do are repeated with a very, sometimes very high frequencies. But we also very rarely operate in a situation in which we have no description, either from the form of advice by a friend or advertisement or reading the instruction, etc. Right? So what we think is that, at least so we believe, the next frontier would be studies which try to integrate these two modalities. Because I think what we actually is more ecological is to suppose that we are constantly subject to some sort of social influence, teaching, advice, or imitation, some sort of objective description based on the feature of the thing, but then we can revise all this belief based on the trial and error experience with these very items or choices that we make.
Oh, so yeah, you could say, for example, which type of learning is most relied on given certain tasks or whatever, or certain other parameters like our interlocutors or the nature of the teacher or something like that.
But yeah, this is important to understand that exactly. So reinforcement learning is not a reductionist agenda, right? And it is a powerful tool, computational and scientifically, because it is relatively simple and parsimonious. But you can complexify it while keeping, as that's interesting, so while keeping a basic core mechanism, which is this notion of reward maximization. There is no reason why this reward maximization should not be informed, for example, of what you know about the structure of the environment, very abstract cognitive abilities to some extent, and social information, etc., etc. So also frontiers of research are, for example, to see how reinforcement learning processes are hierarchically organized. Many tasks in our daily life are highly hierarchically structured, right? So, for example, I tell you, make coffee, you will make coffee, and you will be reinforced of punishments if the coffee is good and bad. But actually, this making coffee was a series of sub-actions, right? Open the coffee machine, actually you can start buying the right coffee, etc. So you can see that you can still... for example, you have a negative feedback for coffee, but doesn't mean you should stop coffee altogether. You can maybe assign the credit of this failure by the fact that you bought the wrong brand of coffee, and just revise this sub-goal within a hierarchy of superior goals. So it's actually very flexible and can actually be built in both humans and machine, can be used to build in both human and machine quite complex behavioral patterns.
So I think here would be a good point to sort of go back to the definition of reinforcement learning that you mentioned. And specifically, you mentioned that an agent could also refer to a machine. So why is it important to see why computers are good at RL? Like, what is the epistemological benefit, and how well do they do it if they do reinforcement learning?
Yeah, so I think it's very, um, it's very telling that since the beginning, for example, Sutton and Bartow, they are artificial intelligence researcher, but actually, especially Sutton, they come from a psychology background, and their original aim, and of other people back in the times and still today, it is actually a very present subset of artificial intelligence researcher. Their goal is to build machines that are clever to understand what is intelligence, right? So, and this is true for reinforcement learning, and this is true for any modeling exercise in general, right? So, whether it is multi-agent modeling of social dynamics, reinforcement learning, etc. So, the idea is that at some point, it's actually quite ingenioristic and pragmatic view that tells you if I can build a working version of it, I have understood it, right? There is nothing more to explain if my artificial agent is behaving in a way that is not discernible from the target of interest. It's also conceptual foundation of the Turing test, right? So in that respect, in a way that is not specific to reinforcement learning, it is actually a well-represented, respected approach to see I am a model, I build a model, and then I see whether the behavior of this model is satisfactory in respect of what I wanted to understand, and I take it as a fair and square explanation of the process of interest.
So, since you also mentioned before that you could view life as a reinforcement learning model, so if we do build machines that are good at, doing reinforcement learning, maybe they should be good at all the things that humans do as well in different domains. Has that transpired to be the case?
What do you mean? Like
in terms of like self-driving cars, for instance, or like being able to identify agents and like images or something of that sort, something that we do routinely on a daily basis very quickly.
Yes, so the application of reinforcement learning and artificial intelligence, they are limitless. And, for example, many of the biggest recent success, for example, from Google DeepMind, such as AlphaGo or Atari games, proficiency, etc., it was indeed achieved with algorithms that contained, even if it was not the only part, RM learning core at their origin. Then reinforcement learning has a problem that, for example, compared to other computational approaches such as deep neural networks, in some time, it can be in a sense slower because, as we say, the agent has to figure out, has to pass through a lot of situations in order to build a correct policy in many situations. While on the other side, maybe the difference compared to other approach is that it is more intelligible, right? Because you will indeed be able to understand actually what the model is doing. On the other side, the most deep neural network models are a little bit more black boxy in this respect. But on the other side, the difficulty of reinforcement learning algorithms is also that, how you shape the reward function is crucial. So it adds essentially two different problems is, to design the agent, but also to design the environment in a way that the agent will find the optimal policies. To some extent, the same is a little bit true also for deep nets concerning defining what is the loss function that is maximized.
Yeah. And to some extent, it's the same for humans, right? Like our environments are adapted to us in some way. So,
but yes, I think, for example, in the case of, in humans, the big question would be, for example, the question the states and policymaker asks is, how do we set up the incentives in order that humans make the best decision? So again, this is a reinforcement learning problem in which the policymaker has to carefully craft the incentive, whether it's on the form of laws or etc., in order to maximize the chance that we, the agent, find out their optimal policy, given, of course, a shared upon utility function, value function that we all agree.
Yeah, you see that with nudges, for example.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So it's I'm not saying that nudges are generally based on reinforcement learning research, and I think they should be more based on reinforcement learning.
Can we quickly explain what nudges are?
Yeah.
Mentioned them better.
So yes, nudges is this idea that based on insights from behavioral sciences, in psychology, economics, or even neuroscience, you can modify the context of a given decision in order that without taking out the freedom of the individual will be more likely to make a desirable decision. Okay, so this is quite abstract, but there's been several instantiation of that. For example, a nudge strategy to increase savings for retirement in the States that's been proposed by Thaler and collaborator is to ask people to engage to increase the savings at the next raise in the payroll. And this is a nudge that leverage on the fact that we are generally impulsive. So if we receive more money now, we want to spend them. But concerning money, our future money, we are more, forward-looking, right? So you can see that the subject can still make the other choice, but turns out that when the question is formulated like that, they make more, forward-looking decisions. This is one example, and there is no field or type of behavioral science finding that it's more adapted for nudging, because in a sense the goal is operational, so whatever works, right? And in that respect, reinforcement learning theory can be actually considered a source of inspiration for this kind of interventions in learning.
So there's possible applications like nudges and things like that. But also we could think that maybe reinforcement learning can go wrong sometimes, or it can be defective in certain organisms. Has this been observed? Are there organisms who can no longer learn in this way?
Yeah, so reinforcement learning can can be associated with behaviors that are not necessarily desirable, right? I think a prime example of this is addiction, right? So addiction, it comes in different forms, but generally, especially pharmacological addiction, is the fact that at some point a particular substance started to be consumed more frequently, to the point that it becomes a burden for the person that is affected by the condition, and also for the entourage and the society. Now, interestingly enough, when you study, as I did, for example, in pharmacology, addictive drugs, you realize that most of them, at the end, overlap in the fact that they activate a neural pathway that is the dopaminergic pathway in the brain. So dopamine, as a reminder, is a neuromodulator that is generated in the brain and released in response to particular stimuli. Actually, in general, it is released in response to reward. So what they do, addictive drugs, is to hijack this natural system for reinforcement learning, because essentially we got it activated artificially, and the brain, of course, cannot make a difference between an artificial and a natural activation, and start thinking, and sorry if my scuffing of the brain is something separate from the person, of course, there's a say, but that this uptake of drug is something very positive, is a positive reinforcement, and should be repeated and repeated and repeated. And the things become repeated so many times that we observe a shift from hedonic, recreational, goal-directed assumption of the substance to what is become an habitual assumption, which is no more even associated to subjective positive feelings, and it can become very, very hard to overcome. Because it is also So in this case, there is also an artificial pharmacological hijacking of the neural process. But in general, this transition from a more active, let's say goal-directed mode of reinforcement learning to habitual reinforcement learning is something that naturally occurs, right? With repetition, tasks that have been successfully completed become habitual. So I don't know how you come to the office every day, but I come by bike. Recently, I shifted from scooter to bike. I had to change a little bit my path because it's not the same route that I can take. And you are hesitant at the beginning in an alert state because you are really monitoring what is going on.
Especially in Paris.
I should actually be always alert in Paris. But despite that, actually, I think that's illustrate my point. At some point, it becomes automatic. And then I can think about what I'm going to say in the podcast when I arrive in the office, because my automatic pilot, which is the habit which has been formed through reinforcement learning, will bring me to the office. And as you said, this you can see the adapted value of this because I can spare time. So basically, I do this, but I don't think about this. I can think about other things. The negative side is that one time that, for example, there is a work road, something like that, I have to change. I can make a mistake because I'm not alert enough, etc., etc. So you may pay the advantage of an habit, even if when the habit is not necessarily drug addiction, right? Something more mundane, such as thing.
So throughout this, it's very interesting to see this relationship between reinforcement learning and addiction. But are there other instances? I'm thinking of mental health disorders where reinforcement learning can go wrong, because I'm thinking of this field called computational psychiatry, which tries to sort of deconstruct this. So if you could also say a few words on what computational psychiatry is.
Yes, so computational psychiatry is this subfield of either psychiatry research or overlapping between psychiatry research and computational cognitive science that try essentially to characterize mental health problems in terms of the underlying neural computation and therefore try to propose maybe a more formal explanation of this disease. The promise of this is that this will help us getting more close to the mechanistic explanation of these mental health problems such as depression, addiction, schizophrenia, etc. And if we understand something better, then we can treat, predict, etc. Right? In the case, so reinforcement learning is up to date one of the main paradigm, experimental and conceptual and computational paradigm that is used in computational psychiatry. And this is because it's one of the more well-studied and well-understood. So, for example, we have a quite clear idea what is a quite basic model of reinforcement learning that you may consider as reasonable implementation. We have also good idea about what are the neural bases, already mentioned the dopamine, etc. So we can build upon this. What concrete example? So we already mentioned the addiction, right? Addiction is essentially a reinforcement learning behavior, right? So it's induced by reinforcement. And it manifests itself as an exacerbated habit, right? But similar problem and can also be found, for example, in compulsivity in general. So the compulsive drug consumption is one thing, but compulsivity can be of many kinds, right? So for example, in obsessive compulsive disorder, you can have hoarding or hand washing, a different manifestation in which there is a particular behavior that for some reason become unchecked and become essentially, basically a mastodontic take amount of time. And even this can be understood, for example, as a shift between the tendency to over-create habits compared to what would be, the right balance to some extent. Other example could also be looking, for example, in anxiety, some form of anxiety or post-traumatic stress disorder could also be conceptualized in the framework of reinforcement learning as exacerbated sensitivity to negative events. In general, you should be more equally sensitive, remember equally well positive and negative events in general. But what if at some point there is an imbalance? At least this imbalance can underpin the arising of anxious diseases.
So, these are a way of conceptualizing certain mental disorders.
Yes.
Do you think that that this leads to different clinical applications?
Well, there is still a long way for this, right? Because it's a quite early science, and there are some methodological points to overcome, right? So let's define what is a clinical application, right? In that case, a clinical application could be, for example, based on computational psychiatry, I develop a behavioral task that I submit to a participant. I extract some computational parameters for this task, and I use this parameter to tell you're going to take this treatment, or no, you're going to take this other treatment, right? So this is what is called computational phenotyping, right? So phenotype is the appearance of because that is also true that one complexity with these diseases is they came in a lot of flavors. So there is no two depressive patients that are the same. There are no two schizophrenic patients that are the same. There are clusters. But sometimes at the beginning you have to tell which cluster one person is going to belong. So one, in principle, application of computational phenotyping could be this computational phenotyping that could be used to better tailor treatment, prognosis, so the prediction of how the pathology is going to evolve. So that this could work, except in my experience in other labs, we realized that the level of noise in the data, at least today, for me is not is too big to think that this kind of measurement can replace, for example, a full-fledged clinical interview, the expertise of a psychiatrist, etc., for this kind of application. Maybe what we can start doing is more on a larger scale, right? Having some games that are actually tested, are gamified, get a sense, and there are some initiatives in this sense, get a sense of what is the profile of the participant, ideally leveraging on different measures, and maybe using this information to alert the participant to somehow.
Could you talk more about these games that you mentioned? Like, what would be a good example of a task which could give us like good data about?
Well, we have seen already that a lot of economics or reinforcement learning tasks, there are trial and error tasking which you have to win, right? So essentially, they could be easily gamified as a way of winning points and losing points, right? In our lab, and one of my former PhD students is continuing in this direction. They also at some point created an experiment, a reinforcement learning task. Was layout was a space shooter in which you have to shoot asteroids, winning points. So you can see it's much more user-friendly to some extent, at least for a younger population. But then, this kind of pre-screening, that coming back to what I was saying, could be useful to maybe alert people that, maybe we have a sign that go see a doctor or something like that. But this also entails huge ethical problem. Who's going to do that? What about confidentiality? If we are not certain that someone is going to develop a diagnosis, should we, put the person in this direction? So it's, and is also, I would say, above my payroll to think about this problem.
Just to shift gears from mental health to artificial intelligence, because that's another theme that's coming up quite a lot. We know that you've been conducting some research on the intersection of cognitive science and artificial intelligence and large language models. Could you just describe to our listeners what that is?
Yes, large language models are a particular set of artificial intelligence devices, hence the models, which are large. So by this portion on space in your computer, and are based on language. But more seriously, essentially, these are models that are trained on huge corpora of text some would say all the internet, probably not all, but in big chunks. And when they are trained, their simple task is to learn to predict as much as possible to simplify the next words. So they are statistical predictive model of language. These, at this level of description, they existed for many years before, but recently there's been a new technological development and architecture that is called the transformer decoder, which by implementing a notion of they call it attention, but sometimes in artificial intelligence they tend to recycle terms from psychology in a way that maybe is not exactly but anyway, but regardless of the metaphor, they perform much better. There's been the release, I mean, the very famous one has been the GPT family up to Chat GPT, which indeed display a degree of generality of the task that they can perform, and also of quality of the response that I think represented a sort of jump in the performance of this kind of tools.
So, since ChatGPT in particular is able to approximate this level of performance that seems very similar to how humans would perform in different tasks, do they also display the same biases that we do? And
exactly the question that we ask. So when I started seeing the first papers and presentation about these models, because of the sort of generality of the task they can perform, I start thinking I would be curious to see whether this model perform standard judgment and decision-making task with the same biases as humans, and other labs also the similar ideas. And this is why with some students and postdoc in the lab, we started essentially administrating standard decision-making tasks to these models to see whether their performance match to those of humans. Of course, we focused on experiment quite different compared to the one I described to you, because these are models of text. So we have to switch to experiments that are done with what we call vignette. So essentially short description or short verbal description with more or less open response possible, that we modified precisely for our experiment. Because an important thing is that when you do this kind of research is to realize that, say, this model was trained on the whole internet. So if you use a task that's been already published, there is what is called a contamination, right? So this task can be part of the corpus that is being used to train the model at the end, right? And if there is this contamination, then the results can be a little bit false. So it's not really. So we took standard tasks that we modified in order to be not exactly the same, and we ran the experiment in both humans and the machine to compare their performances.
And did you find the same biases, or are there crucial differences that people should be aware of?
Yeah, so what we find is not a clear answer, unfortunately. I mean, or fortunately, it depends on how you see it. Because we tested, so compared to the first study in this direction that were only focused on GPT, we actually tested, if I remember correctly, 8 different models. So different development of OpenAI models plus ChatGPT and GPT-4. And we could observe a very significant divide between the performance in the early release, which presented even an exacerbated cognitive bias compared to humans.
Oh, wow.
And the more recent release, which both performed at superhuman performance in the task that we considered. So displaying no or very little biases and even an average level of accuracy, basically sailing level of accuracy. So perfect performance.
Do you know why this would be? What changed?
No, and that's a problem of this kind of research, is that OpenAI models are not open source, are black box, and there is very sparse information concerning what changed from a model to another one. There are hints that sometimes we know from sporadic publication, etc., that sometimes there are differences are driven on what is called fine-tuning or post-training. So once you have the basic model, you can fine-tune the model by OpenAI described this based on human feedback. So essentially, they asked human participants to rate the response of the model, and based on the response, they created a new training system that fine-tuned the model to respond better. But in the case of ChatGPT and GPT-4, we think that everybody thinks there is something more radical. So a better selection of the corpus, for example, could be one possibility. But this is also why the lab we are moving to open source model, because we have a full information and control of what is going on, essentially.
Yeah.
And this is actually, I think, that model just a problem for us in the lab, right? So the fact that these models will be so important tomorrow, and that most of them proprietary of companies. Again, I'm not an expert in law or things like that, but we can already see at the level of the research that it poses problem to, a steady advancement in the understanding of their capacities, essentially.
Yeah, and as they take prominence in our lives, like even intuitively, without going into the law or whatever, it does seem like that could pose a very concrete problem. Yeah, that we don't know what the principles behind these tools we're using. Okay, so a question we like to ask is: do you have any recommendations of things in popular media, for example, films, books that could illustrate or that call back the themes of the things we've discussed today?
An advice, but this is more maybe for psychology, cognitive neuroscience students, is to not to be afraid to go back and reading the classics, even books from the 20s, 30s, etc. They are actually often very well written and in a surprisingly clear manner. And so I found it also very, very rewarding to come back to this, and it's something that's very useful in my research. Of course, for reinforcement learning, the book is already mentioned, which is Reinforcement Learning: An Introduction by Sattler and Barto. This is more maybe for the more mathematically proficient listener, even though the first few chapters are quite accessible and that is very clearly explained.
The last thing that we also ask our interviewees is whether they would like to clarify anything that was said before or add on to whatever we discussed so far.
I think maybe one last thing interesting concerning the large language model. It is important to clarify because even for me, I have doubts about that, right? So why we should study this model with tools from cognitive sciences? I think one temptation could be to think that we want to study them because they are model of human cognition. And although I cannot put a definitely no to this possibility, given the structure and the way they are built, their ontogeny, would say, like the ontogeny is quite different. I'm not sure that they will be interesting. Also, for example, when my students show me the activation matrices of the attention system, it's like looking at an alien brain, and I think that that's the right way to approach it, right? So, but meaning that if we were to discover another species, we would be very motivated to study that at the behavioral level, without pretending that we are gonna learn something about our own brain, right?
Oh, so we have created our own aliens in a way. This was Cognitions. We were chatting with Stefano Palminteri. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was very fun. Thank you.
On the next episode of Cognitions, we'll chat with Sam Wilkinson about an emerging framework in cognitive science called predictive processing. If you are interested in knowing how applying this framework could lead to a novel understanding of mental health phenomena like delusions, hallucinations, and voice hearing, this episode is not to be missed.